So a week has passed since the release of the Flashstorm DLC for MechWarrior 5 Clans, and since beating the campaign last weekend, I have not been able to stop thinking about it. Chiefly, I've been thinking about where the story might be going next. I've seen a lot of people talking about that same question, read plenty of comments from people who have their own ideas, and I thought it'd be fun to make a little speculation video on my end, that maybe in a year or two we can look back on and see how right or wrong I was. Most of the discussion I've read is focused around the topic of what clan we might be looking at next, and other people thinking what other conflicts we might see down the line. But at some point later in this video, I also want to think about what kind of character stories we've not seen yet, and maybe how we can fit some of those ideas into our framework of different clans. Now, I think there are a couple of assumptions we can make right off the bat. That is that any new DLC that does come out is almost certainly going to be looking at a different clan from the two that we have seen so far, Smoke Jaguar and Ghost Bear. And I think the other thing we know, almost for certain, is that at some point we are going to get Tukayyid. While we have seen individual stories play out over the course of the two campaigns we've got, you can't really tell the full story of Operation Revival without having its conclusion. Now, although I'm certain that we will be getting Tukayyid at some point, I'm equally sure that it will not be the next DLC we get to. And the big reason for that is that I don't think we've had the setup for it yet. And it's such an enormous conflict, it's literally the biggest confrontation between battle mechs in the setting. I don't think you can waste any time trying to explain why it is that Comstar changes sides. From a new player's perspective, we've only seen them working alongside the clans. Yes, it's quite clear that neither party fully trusts the other, and we've even had some hints at Comstar's underhanded double dealings. But you can't just jump from neutral communications company to, oh, we've actually got a secret massive army and we're going to protect Earth. I would wager that the next DLC will end with that shift and the revelation that Comstar has a lot more going on than they first admitted to. Going back to Tukayyid though, there are a few different ways you could try to tell that story, and I think there's one that's much more likely than the others. Now, while it would be possible to do a complete 180 and actually do Tukayyid from Comstar's POV, I don't think that would be a very satisfying way to conclude the story that we've seen set up over the course of multiple clan campaigns. So it becomes a question of, do you tell Tukayyid from a single clan's POV, or do you try to cover a range of highlights involving several of the characters that we've seen in prior DLCs and campaigns up till that point? Now, the first option there I would say is much more likely. The only thing that might change that is if Tukayyid comes much later in the game's life cycle than I would anticipate. In a situation where we actually have 2 or even 3 more DLCs before getting to Tukayyid, which I would not expect, then I think it becomes more plausible to try and tell lots of smaller stories involving those other characters. But that also means you would be reliant on your player having purchased those other campaigns. Otherwise, you're reliant on them building a connection and having an attachment to characters that they might not even have met before. And that's why I think it's just more likely that it'll be just a single clan POV. That way, you can do all the setup for the important characters at the beginning and tell an individual story for those characters over the course of Tukayyid. Now, I've definitely brought up this next issue before at various points throughout my playthroughs of MechWarrior 5 Clans, but that is, it's very difficult to tell a story that ultimately ends in a loss, a defeat, and have that be satisfying. But, as we all know, that is the ultimate fate of the clan invasion of the Inner Sphere. They are defeated at Tukayyid. And if we're not going to do it as a Comstar DLC, which we are definitely not going to, I would say there's less than 0.1% chance of that. The only other way you can do it is to find smaller individual victories within that grander campaign. And the most obvious candidate for that is Clan Wolf. Of the 7 clans that participate, only they are declared outright victors in their individual campaign, even after all of Comstar's forces were redeployed to try and hold them back, contain them, after defeating the other clans. Now there were two other clans that achieved a partial victory, a draw, those being Ghost Bear and Jade Falcon. Now we've already had Ghost Bear as a DLC. We're definitely not going to get a second Ghost Bear DLC for Tukayyid, that just doesn't add up. Jade Falcon is a possibility, but I think Clan Wolf is much more likely. So if you agree with me and you believe that Wolf is going to be how we get the story of Tukayyid, then their POV is essentially reserved until we get to that point in the timeline, which means it's much more likely that our next DLC will be Jade Falcon. I've seen some people point to the fact that in the Ghost Bear DLC, you can actually unlock a Jade Falcon Delta Galaxy camo scheme for one of the mechs. I think it's the Nightjar if you have enough experience in it. And people have tried to use that as an indication that Jade Falcon's coming next. I don't really think that's evidence by itself, especially since we've already seen a Wolf camo scheme. Yes, you can't unlock it, but it was present in the Smoke Jaguar campaign during the climactic battle in which Leo Showers is killed. I would say there remains a slim possibility that we will see one of the reserve clans before Tukayyid, those being Novacat, Steel Viper, Diamond Shark. That all depends, I would say, on how successful Flash Storm and whatever the third Jade Falcon DLC is. Even then, I don't think they want to delay getting to Tukayyid for too long, so I just don't think it's something that's likely to happen in the short term. Back near the beginning of the Smoke Jaguar campaign, we saw the original 4 clans that took part in Operation Revival from the get-go: Jade Falcon, Wolf, Ghost Bear, and Smoke Jaguar themselves. If I try to put myself in the shoes of someone who's new to the setting, or at least unfamiliar with the clan invasion timeline, it would be very strange just to go and look at another clan before having covered each one of those 4 first. And since we've already established that Clan Wolf is most likely going to be how we tell the story of Tukayyid, that's why I think the second DLC will be Jade Falcon, and then the third one, Tukayyid with Wolf. The next question then is, what does that next DLC have to do? And I would say there's 3 important story beats it's got to cover. First, it's got to set up Comstar as the antagonist, the villain. At the end of the next campaign, the clans and Comstar have to already be sizing each other up. It's probably going to end with the revelation that the clans are heading directly for Earth. They're all competing with each other to get to Earth first. The second thing I'd say it's got to do is it's got to build on the rivalries between clans more than the 2 campaigns we've got so far have done. And there is perhaps no clan that is better placed to explore that relationship than Jade Falcon themselves. If you know the timeline, you know that Wolf and Jade Falcon are constantly at each other's necks throughout the whole thing. Furthermore, when the Steel Vipers show up in their invasion corridor, they have a much more antagonistic relationship with the people they're sharing the space with than, say, the Smoke Jaguars and Novacats do over in Draconis Combine space. The reason I think it's so important to build on that concept now is because of how much of a big part it plays in Tukayyid later on. The clans lose because they don't help each other. They are directly competing with each other and almost see defeating Comstar as something that's just going to happen by default. And it's a race between themselves to see who does it first. They never really take the actual battle that seriously until it's too late, and they don't come to each other's aid when things start to go wrong. And the third and final thing that the next DLC needs to do is, of course, set up another great house, the Federated Commonwealth, the Steiner Davians. And there are lots of different ways that they could go about doing that. Now, House Kurita was set up as the big bad throughout the Smoke Jaguar campaign, and again into the Ghost Bear one. We even see Theodore Kurita at one point later on in the DLC. But Kurita is off in one corner of the Inner Sphere, and where the Jade Falcon and Clan Wolf are invading, they're dealing exclusively with the Federated Commonwealth. So if we're going to introduce this new antagonist in the form of the Federated Commonwealth, I think you need some sort of figurehead to personify that, especially since you have only a short DLC campaign to do it in. Now yes, Hans Adavian is running the war, but he's nowhere near the front lines. However, his son, Victor Stein-Adavian, someone who's hugely important to the setting in later eras as well as the clan invasion itself, he is. Now, just as is the case with Theodore Kurita, his story is already very well laid out and explored in the novels, so I don't think we need to focus too much about him, but it would be interesting to see at the same time the Jade Falcons going after him, pursuing him. Both campaigns we've gotten up until this point conclude roundabout at the end of the second book in the Blood of Kerensky trilogy. Now that book ends with 3 simultaneous battles, the biggest of which is of course Luthien, which we've already covered. There's something about the heir of the Free Razelhaig Republic being captured, but the third battle is happening in the Federated Commonwealth against Jade Falcon on Alina, or Alyena, however you want to say it. Now the Jade Falcons set up a trap to capture Victor Stein-Adavian on Alina. He ultimately does get away, but his companion, Kai Alad Liao, falls in battle. Now Alina is one option, but there are 4 other planets that Jade Falcon attacked during the 5th and final wave of Operation Revival. I'm going to focus on those 5 because I think it's unlikely that another DLC will be set earlier in the invasion than the Ghost Bear one we just had. I think with Tukayyid being PGI's end goal, they want to be building towards that, not going back to earlier in the invasion to look at something like Twycross, for example. As much as I would love to see Nikolai Malthus and Adam Steiner go at it on Somerset, I don't think it best serves the overarching story that they're working on. But like I said, there are 4 other planets that might be of interest: Lagrave, Pandora, Quarrel, and Sudeten. Now Lagrave, we don't really know much of anything about it. I guess if they want to tell something completely unique, there's an opportunity there to explore a campaign in the 5th wave of Operation Revival involving Jade Falcon and not be restricted to what is already existing in the lore. Plenty of opportunity there if they want to go in that direction. Quarrel, I think, is an interesting one, because that's actually the planet that Star Colonel Aidan Pride of the Jade Phoenix trilogy participated in. We already had Marta Pride in Ghost Bear, and if we already want more cameos like that, there's an opportunity to do something with him there. On the topic of cameos, Sudeten also has its own possibilities there. Among the fanbase, the only other mercenary group I'd say that comes close to matching the fame of, say, Wolf's Dragoons and the Kellhounds is the Grey Death Legion, and they were based on Sudeten. One additional benefit of pitting the players against the Grey Death Legion is that they were the very first mercenaries to make use of Inner Sphere battle armor, so it would allow PGI to incorporate some of the gameplay mechanics they first introduced with the Flash Storm DLC, except it wouldn't be elementals we're going up against, it would be the Grey Death equivalent. The planet itself is significant for another reason though. In the 3058 Falcon incursion, Sudeten is where an enormous battle takes place, involving multiple successor states. If they do choose to pick that world though, it pairs quite nicely with the 5th and final planet I mentioned, and that's Pandora. After the Grey Death is kicked off Sudeten, they redeploy to Pandora, and there they give the Jade Falcons their second major defeat of Operation Revival after Twycross. The Ghost Bear campaign came with 12 missions. Now, 9 of those were on Alshane, but one thing they could do with Jade Falcon is split it 50-50 between Sudeten and Pandora, show a victory on the first planet and a defeat on the second one. And while that story is unfolding, also have Comstar in the background starting to turn on the clans, maybe allow the player to listen in on some of the initial discussion about Tukayyid itself, setting it up for that later Wolf campaign, and all the while playing up the antagonistic relationship between Jade Falcon and the Steel Vipers, and especially Clown Wolf. One final advantage of including Pandora in the next DLC might also be that it allows you to set up the idea that things are starting to turn against the clans. They came to the Inner Sphere, laid waste to everybody before them, but now the resistance is galvanized behind the Federated Commonwealth and the Draconis Combine, and not everything's going their way. It kind of sets up the later defeat that is coming for them at Tukayyid. I don't want to get too sidetracked now, but one of my favourite conversations in all the novels happens in the third Jade Phoenix book, and that is when all the Jade Falcon, Galaxy Commanders, Khans, Star Colonels are all gathered round, having their meeting as Tukayyid is unfolding around them, and they all start to realise that their manifest destiny is unravelling, and things are going against them, and they have no idea how to stop it. Following some clanners as they start to experience this fear, this worry that things aren't going to end well. I think we've got a good story potential there. Switching topic a little bit, the final point I really want to discuss in this video is different story ideas for characters. I would say there are two major ones that come to mind that we've not got yet, and yet we've had quite a few hints towards them in the Smoke Jaguar and Ghost Bear campaigns. Now the first is the idea of earning a blood name. It's something that Alexander Hoyt discussed a little bit with Jaden at the end of Smoke Jaguar, but it was much more important and stressed more heavily in the Ghost Bear DLC. I think it's a good possibility that a contest for a blood name may happen in the second DLC, the next one to come out. While I think that would be an interesting story beat for a character, I can't help but think of all the difficulties that would come with trying to do that in an engaging way for a player. Let's say your character wants to earn themselves a blood name, but they're not sponsored. Well, they need to participate in the melee that precedes it and earn that final place. If you're not familiar with how blood name contests play out, I'm pretty sure there are 32 people put forwards into the competition. Now don't quote me on this, but I am pretty sure that 23 of those 32 candidates are sponsored by other people who share that blood name themselves, who actively have it. Now there's one free space, of course, from someone who's died, who people are competing for their name, but it's the elected head of the Bloodhouse, the person with the most seniority, who is in possession of a particular blood name, who puts forwards 8 candidates themselves, leaving just one free slot, and that is the winner of the melee. How many people participate in a melee? I don't think there's a strict number. Anyone can go and join it if they feel that way inclined, but they're a complete free-for-all. And I think that it by itself could be an interesting mission to do. Something where everyone's in an arena and they're all fighting each other. No, it's not clans against Inner Sphere, it's every man or woman out for themselves. That would be very unlike anything else we've done so far in the 2 campaigns we've got. So that would definitely be interesting. It starts to fall apart once you get to the one-on-one duels. If there are 32 candidates, that means there are 5 rounds of duels before you ultimately end with one winner. Now in the lore, days pass between duels, sometimes whole weeks if someone's been injured. You could do all 5 in one mission, just hand wave it away, I don't have a problem with that. When I first had this thought, I was just imagining that they would skip through all the early duels and with a cutscene or something, and then go straight to the finale. But try to think how that would work in actual gameplay, where you're just going to fight one mech, presumably a mech and not an aerospace fighter or an elemental. We fought in the campaigns, even the levels that have the fewest number of mechs, you're fighting a dozen or more. Even if you make them elite rated, well, a one-on-one fight, there's no way the AI can possibly compete against the player. So it doesn't sound like that would be a very engaging and fun level to play. The only way they could do it is if they constantly took control away with interruptions. Let's say the battle doesn't play out in a traditional sense in its normal kind of gameplay loop for MechWarrior, but you have an initial engagement and maybe there's some sort of terrain keeping the player and the opponent apart, and then when they do enough damage, the AI runs behind a rock and you get a short interruption, not quite a full cutscene, but you can imagine something rendered real time. And then the second phase begins, slightly different environment, slightly different positioning. You could make it work like that, but it would be a little bit gimmicky, and I don't know how much fun it would be. If you did choose to include a fight like that in a DLC, I think it kind of forces you to do it early on, because that's not much of a climax to build towards. Yes, it would be for a character to earn their blood name, but from a player, that's a very kind of novel way to end a campaign, if you get what I mean. Conversely though, a fight for a blood name might be a great way to kick off the DLC, like we did with Ghost Bear on Huntress, where they did those trials of possession against Jade Falcon and Smoke Jaguar. Start with a melee, that's something radically different to what we've seen, and maybe have the second mission, either all 5 of the jewels at once, again that's kind of breaking the law a little bit, but I don't really care, or just have that final heavily scripted engagement between 2 mechs. That way, yes, it is a bit of a gimmick fight, but you still have the full length of the DLC to enjoy after that. The only problem I foresee with that is you're not fully engaged with the character yet to have such an important story beat happen that early on. So you would be deprived of the emotional impact that something like that would have. So yes, it does have some challenges, but I think trying to earn a blood name is surely a very significant moment in any clan warrior's life. It would be strange not to try and include it at some point in one of the DLCs for MechWarrior 5 clans. The other very different story they could try to tell in the next DLC, or one of them anyway, is the idea of a Solahma unit, or even a Freeborn unit. In Ghost Bear we saw Rick Becker, an older warrior who was still trying to cling to his youth, hold on to that performance on the battlefield by getting those neural implants that was kind of slowly robbing him of his own sanity, because he didn't want to be redeployed to a Solahma unit, and indeed Lilith didn't want to send him to one. In a tragic way, it's the ultimate disgrace. You've failed to find a good death for yourself on the battlefield. But that Solahma unit doesn't necessarily need to be populated exclusively with aging warriors. There could be a really fun, interesting dynamic to have the star split between people who have had a long career with Jade Falcon, or whatever clan it ends up being, and others who are freeborn, who didn't have that leg up at the start, who got relegated to a provisional garrison cluster. I mentioned Quarrel earlier with Aiden Pride. We could see a similar kind of story play out on another planet that wasn't taken in the 5th wave by Jade Falcon, but rather was attacked by Steel Viper somewhere else in their invasion corridor. That definitely has potential in my mind as well. Remind everybody, the clans are not the good guys. Just because you're born into the warrior caste doesn't mean your life is going to be great. To do the story of a Jade Falcon Solahma unit in the next DLC with Jade Falcon would also kind of parallel a lot of Robert Thurston's own books. That's a big part of the Legend of the Jade Phoenix trilogy, and indeed his next book, I Am Jade Falcon, where you have Star Captain Joanna trying to hold on to a position on the front line because she doesn't want to be relegated to one of these Solahma units. While in one sense it would be interesting to see the parallel there between the games and the books, it's also kind of retreading ground that's already been covered. So perhaps a Solahma unit would be better used in perhaps a later DLC covering a different clan, so it's not just a repeat of what we've had before in the novels. So we'll end this video with kind of long-term expectations. I would wager we're pretty likely to get 2 more DLCs for MechWarrior 5 clans. Next one will be Jade Falcon, covering some of the ideas, possibly, probably, that I've mentioned here. And then the third DLC will be Tukayyid with Clan Wolf. How many more we get after that, I think really depends on the success of those first 3. I see so many people calling out for some sort of open world, more Mercs-like gameplay. Because it's such a popular request, I do suspect at some point they will try to do that, but in what form that comes, I couldn't say. They have mentioned a couple times returning to Mercs and doing a 7th DLC for that game, probably involving the clans to some degree. What I think is more likely, though, is that after we conclude Operation Revival, the invasion with Tukayyid, we enter the truce years. And there is potential within the, 7 years between those earlier conflicts and the Twilight of the Clans series of books, that being Operation Bulldog, later Operation Serpent. We know for a fact that there are raids going on between the clans and the Inner Sphere. If people really want a return to that familiar gameplay loop from Mercs, fitting it into that period there, I think, is the most likely place where it could be done. The challenge with that, though, is that it would just be a huge undertaking in my mind to try and introduce a very different style of gameplay, that unit management. Yes, it's something they've done before in Mercs, but incorporating all of those features into clans in a satisfying way would surely come with a whole slew of new challenges. The risk then becomes that when it is finally implemented, it's too bare bones to satisfy the people who are really wanting that kind of content. With mod support, I could see that growing out. It's such a popular request, though, it's very difficult to see how PGI could ignore those calls, even though personally it's just not something that I would mind whether they added or not. They, of course, have to pursue what's going to make financial sense for them as well, so we may end up getting something like that after Tukayyid. Just to end this video with some wild, baseless speculation on where they could go next, though, I was reading an interview on Sarna with Chris Lowry, PGI's narrative director, and he did mention by name the Refusal War, and he said it was more likely that we'd see that than a continuation of Jaden's story, and you can understand why. Any DLC they would do would have to be 2 wildly different halves, or would have to only focus on one potential ending, leaving half the people who chose the other ending, if they Warden or Crusader, without a continuation of their own story. So yeah, that's just a mess. It's not worth getting back into. I think another reason the Refusal War is another likely candidate for a post-Tukayyid DLC, if those earlier ones prove successful, is the way in which it harkens back to MechWarrior 2, way back in the 90s, 30 years ago. But the problem with the Refusal War is, although it's much smaller a conflict than Operation Revival, it's difficult to see how it can be done in a single DLC, one, or at least one of the same size as Flashstorm, which we just got. You had 12 missions, which added up to about 8 hours of gameplay? I guess if you were to try, you would have some cutscenes at the beginning setting up how the Crusader faction within Clan Wolf turned on Kerensky, or the Kerenskys. And then if you're not familiar with the story, Fel took half the clan, the Warden half of the clan, on an exodus into the Inner Sphere, while Natasha and Ulrich Kerensky led the Crusader faction in just a mad charge against Jade Falcon to buy the other half time to escape. Thinking about it now, actually, I was imagining that it would have to be told from Clan Wolf perspective, but maybe you could do a 50-50, one planet for Jade Falcon and one planet for the Wolves. You could have some cutscenes early on to set it up, and then skip forwards to later in 3057, where the Kerenskys are coming to the end of their path into Jade Falcon territory at Wotan and Twycross. Early on in the Refusal War, the Jade Falcon threw all of their kind of garbage garrison clusters and Solahma units at the wolves to slow them down, to weaken them before their stronger units faced off against them towards the end of the year. So maybe there's the potential for that Solahma idea that I had to factor into one of the DLCs there. Post-Refusal War, the next major event is the Jade Falcon incursion in 3058. Doing that from the clan perspective, by that point it would be the third Jade Falcon DLC, so I don't see how that would be likely. Perhaps the Jade Falcon incursion could be the end point for the Mercs style DLC that I mentioned. And lastly, you've got to take things back to where they began, Twilight the clans, to finish out MechWarrior 5 clan's life cycle. Going after Smoke Jaguar, through Operation Bulldog, fighting them back off the worlds that they took from the Draconis Combine, then pushing them all the way back to Huntress, where we began our adventure. In my mind, that would be a very fitting way to kind of conclude the game's life cycle. I'm talking about 2027, 2028 by this point, if we ever get that far. Again, you run into the same issue of how do you tell such a grand story, something that took 8 novels to do in just one DLC? You pretty much can't. And then as soon as you start breaking it down, let's do multiple DLCs on that, you get into a ridiculous situation where you're expecting clans to have 10 DLCs to do the whole thing. In summary then, I think 2 more are definitely likely. One for Jade Falcon, setting up Tukayyid, and then Tukayyid itself as the 3rd DLC. So many people are asking for a mercenary style gameplay in clans that I can't imagine them doing any other DLC after Tukayyid until they at least attempt that. Whether they do or not, I can't say. And then the further you get away from the invasion, the likelihood of future DLCs just becomes less and less. So don't get me wrong, I would love to see Refusal War, Incursion, and Twilight of the Clans to wrap it up. Who knows whether we will ever see that. At the end of the day, those events have already been covered in MechWarrior 2, 3, and indeed Mech Commander. But regardless of what they do choose to work on next, I can't wait. Everything they've released up till this point has just been fantastic from my point of view, and I have no doubt that whatever comes next will be of that same standard. If you've made it to the end, thank you very much for listening, guys. Please let me know what you think down in the comments below, and I'll hope to see you again soon for another video.